Hey, Matt.
Hello, how are you?
Glad you could join us.
Yeah, might have a couple other people join us too.
Little ones?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Trying to get my virtual background to work, but it doesn't seem to want to work for me.
I just get tired of seeing what's behind me, so I need to change the scenery. So,
All right, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Kara Decker. I am the Stormwater Program Coordinator at ELGRO and will be moderating this question and answer session with our speakers this afternoon. We hope that you've all had time to view all of the 17th Annual Grand River Spring Forum presentations. If you haven't, don't worry. The recordings will be available on the ELGRO website and on the ELGRO YouTube page. This webinar this afternoon is being recorded and will later be available after this meeting along with our other presentations. If you could go to the next slide, Dan. ELGRO would like to thank the many sponsors of this year's forum for their continued support of our programs. We couldn't do it without all of you. And one more slide, Dan. Some logistical information about today's webinar. The entire audience is muted, but we want you to stay engaged. So please, we encourage you to ask questions of our speakers, and to do so, please type your question in the chat box and make sure that you're typing to all panelists and attendees so that I and the ELGRO team working behind the scenes can see your question. Without further ado, I would like to turn this over to our panelists so that we can get the discussion going. I would ask that each presenter briefly introduce themselves, their name, position where you work, and then please tell us what you presented on for the forum today, and then we'll get into our questions. So Wendy, if you would start us out.
Sure, thanks, Kara. Hi, this is Wendy Ogilvie. I'm the Director of Environmental Programs at the Grand Valley Metro Council. And I introduced the forum with the first presentation, and then Sophia and I have been working on a resilience plan, and she did the presentation for the forum.
Thanks. Beth?
Hi, everyone. I am Beth Gibbons. I'm the Executive Director at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I had the honor to do the keynote address, and in that I addressed the state of climate and state of climate change adaptation, the role of watersheds and green infrastructure in advancing climate adaptation and resilience, and the intersection between really doing work that is transformative and work that is incremental, and how we think about our day-to-day efforts in a way that moves us towards the transformative change that we need in our climate policy and all of our policies today.
Josh.
Hello, my name is Josh Arnold. I am a grad student at GVSU in the biology department. In addition to that, I also work for Grand Valley Metropolitan Council, mostly on the restoration of the river project. My presentation today was on the translocation of freshwater mussels.
Dan.
Hi, my name is Daniel Schoonmaker. I'm the Executive Director of the West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and my presentation was on normalizing climate resiliency for business institutions in West Michigan.
Matt.
Hello, my name is Matt Chapman. I'm a project manager for Grand Rapids Whitewater, and my presentation today was on the Grand River restoration and the efforts to bring the rapids back to Grand Rapids.
Peter.
Hi, my name is Peter Wampler, and I'm a fluvial geomorphologist at Grand Valley State University. And I've been working with Jill Ashton on a what's called a Student Summer Scholar program to do monitoring of the Grand River, water quality monitoring.
Jillian.
Hi, my name is Jillian Ashton. I'm a fourth-year student at Grand Valley. I did my presentation today with Peter Wampler on the comprehensive water quality sampling of the Grand River.
Sophia.
Hey, I'm Sophia Bryson, and I have been working with ELGRO to develop the watershed resilience plan that Wendy mentioned, and I was presenting on that climate resilience in the Lower Grand River watershed and how that can be implemented by subwatersheds.
Thanks. And then Lee Mueller was also a presenter. He is, we're trying to work on getting him into the conversation. He's online with us today. He works for Davie Resource Group, and his presentation was on building urban forest capacity in the watershed, and he presented on some great projects that Davie is partnering with ELGRO on. So thank you, panelists, for being here. And the first question that we have sort of applies to everyone. The Lower Grand River watershed covers a very large area of land, some of which is urbanized and much that is rural and agricultural. How does resilience need to change moving from urban to more rural areas, and how do we approach that? Wendy, if you'd like to start us out.
Sure. As was presented in our presentation about the Watershed Resilience Plan, a lot of the strategies are the same, but the techniques do look different, whether it's an urban or an agricultural or rural area. You know, there's sometimes just larger practices that have to be done in a greater expanse of area. Certainly there's different partners that need to be involved. You know, and looking more at, a lot of times the ag lands are more maybe in the headwater areas, or looking at different ways to do stream protection. And it really presents an opportunity for some of that reforestation. So kind of ties into what Lee was saying too, but just being able to use some of those lands in, I guess, just in multi-use ways and different ways of being resilient. I don't know, Sophia, do you want to add anything to that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I would say in addition to practical differences, another thing we've been considering in developing the plan is the angle with which you approach it, that we have some audiences within the watershed who are responsive to just the language of climate change, that's sufficient to get some people invested and on board, but that there are other stakeholders in the watershed who are a bit more wary about that language, and so instead talking about erratic weather or the direct economic or agricultural impacts can be more influential in those areas. So targeting the message to really address the various concerns that exist within the watershed and how those change between land use.
Yeah, so when we're talking about this difference in urban versus rural land use, how would that apply to everyone else's specific project or your work. Maybe Dan, do you see a difference in how you approach resiliency with businesses based on maybe where they're located in the watershed?
Oh, yeah. So well, before we even talk about kind of the institutional and the brick and mortar impacts, I think the thing the most prominent recognizes would be the demographic differences between a rural and urban community. And if you look at when they've mapped out geographically the aggregate vulnerabilities to climate change, typically in Michigan, they find that the rural communities are likely to actually improve as a result of climate change, and make living conditions better for them in aggregate. Whereas it's the exact flip side in dense urban areas where existing vulnerabilities are going to be accentuated and have impacts on public health and on urban runoff and so on and so forth. From an organizational institutional standpoint, I think it's likely more a question of municipal assets and available partners than it is specifically urban versus rural, and who you're going to rely on to as a business institution to take stewardship of critical infrastructure that you rely on that could be impacted by climate change.
Yeah, and Beth, through your work, have you had participation with more rural entities? And if so, how does maybe their perspective differ?
Yeah, so both through my current experience with ASAP, we work with communities across the country from rural to urban, and we engage with people whether they're working in extreme restoration to building engineering. So I've had a lot of experience working across sectors. When I was previously with the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Program, GLISA, at University of Michigan and Michigan State, we've focused on how do we ensure that climate information is reaching all users across the Great Lakes region. And in the keynote, I talked about this framework that we use of not discussing just what climate change will do, but talking about first what has happened. And you begin this conversation with what has happened, then what will happen, and what are the impacts. And when you start with this discussion of what has happened, people who live in more rural areas really have a close connection to the environment that they're in. They tend to be people who either are relying more on agricultural activities or just have more space and more time to be outdoors and outside. And they have a really keen sense, a lived experience of the climate changes that are already with us. And so starting that from a position where you're ensuring that you're recognizing the expertise and the knowledge of the people whom you're working with, and then using climate data to reinforce what they already know about the changes that they're experiencing is really important. I think what Sophia said too about choosing your messaging, because the way that I approach my work right now at ASAP is that we talk about climate change and we talk about justice. And we're very, very clear about those are the aspects that we are trying to advance, climate adaptation and equity and justice. When I worked at GLISA, our work took, I would say, a more nuanced approach because our job was to find boundary organizations and to build trust and trusted relationships. So it was really important for us to use the language that was resonant with the people who we worked with. And so it was a lot about meeting people where they are. And that might be talking with them about their crop conditions. It might be talking with them about their flooded basements. It might be talking about, more extreme storms, the freeze-thaw cycles. And so I think that those pieces, if you're really intentional about recognizing the expertise of the people who you're engaging with, working in rural communities becomes pretty easy because the experience of climate change is really acutely felt. They're very aware of it, and you can really elevate their lived knowledge and then adopt the language that they are already using in order to keep moving the work forward.
Yeah, Lee, you had specifically kind of mentioned this in your presentation, talking about the different communities that you had worked with, specifically with the Relief program. And I'm just wondering, what were some of the biggest challenges working for each type of area when you're looking at like rural versus more urban communities?
Yeah, and we've done the same program in other watersheds in Michigan, including Grand Traverse Bay, where you have a really a lot of more rural communities and urban communities. But I think particularly in this watershed, some of the challenges where you have, I mean, we had a pretty interesting cross section of communities. You know, Granville is a little bit more developed. Hudsonville is a historically agricultural community, and then Ferrysburg being more of a community built in the forest. And so the implications of how to manage trees in those populations, or how to keep trees or add trees, is very different. And so we just had to go the extra effort, I think, in orienting our mindset towards how has that community's interaction been with their natural forest anyway? And do they still have a natural forest, or is it more of a developing forest? Even talking about an urban forest, still a natural system. So I think at the end of the day, the unique differences of each community and how the community has historically managed trees or developed trees in their community really changes what you would recommend as outcomes. You know, is it, if you're trying to expand tree canopy, is it more about planting, or is it going to be more about preservation, right? That's the real fork when you start to talk about these issues.
Yeah, and this topic, I think applies to Peter and Jillian's work also, because the two of you are going to be sampling throughout the entire river. And so how do you anticipate that your data is going to change as you're moving through the entire river? You're going to hit some, you know, heavily agricultural areas and then move through urban areas too. How do you anticipate that your data is going to look different as you move through different parts of the river?
I think speaking for both me and Peter, we're expecting to do a huge data set for continuous data throughout the river itself. So we'll be collecting data from the headwaters all the way to the mouth of the river. So like you said, we are going to be seeing probably a lot of changes throughout the river. In doing so, we're going to be doing a lot of comparisons with the 1990 data that we have. And when we look at the 1990 data from the past expedition, we've seen a lot of changes as we go through those urban areas, like as expected. We also kind of expect to see kind of spikes in potential nitrate and phosphate levels as we're kind of go downriver from potential like agricultural runoff parts. And then we're also going to be, from that, we can kind of just see like the changes that we are going to see potentially from rural and urban spots as well. And then we can kind of see like the resiliency in terms of what we're going to see there.
Yeah, I think Jill did a good job summarizing it. I think also we'll be able to, that 1990 data set is really interesting. We have 35 sites on the whole river that we can compare. And I think we can do a reasonable job of kind of assessing what's been done in some of these urban areas to improve water quality. And if it worked or not, we can do that kind of assessment. And we can also see whether the rural areas have seen changes in that 3 decades of time that has passed. So we're hoping to find other data sets, but that's the one data set we have that's the best, kind of most complete for the whole river.
For the data that the two of you will be collecting this summer, is there a way for the rest of us to be able to follow your data collection? Or where will we be able to find that data in the future, I guess?
Well, certainly we have to prepare a report for the Student Summer Scholar Program that Jill is part of, and that'll be available for everybody. And then we're also hoping to post the data with ELGRO on their data kind of repository. But we're hopefully going to make it as available as quick as we can as soon as we collect it and get it out there. And yeah, so we can kind of have a running idea what's happening with that water quality. And then, you know, the original plan was to go on the expedition, which was supposed to happen this year, and we were going to float the entire reach. We've had to modify that plan a little bit. So we're probably going to do an initial sampling from vehicles, which has good and bad points, but we'll get a better snapshot in time that way of the river. And then we'll also follow up in areas that we're interested in looking at deeply.
All right, my next question is for Josh. How long after moving the mussels in your project will it take until you're able to see how they're affected?
I would predict anywhere from 3 months to 1 year. Mussels in the wintertime will mostly spend their entire time on the substrate and not grow. So I'll have to go through a full summer and a spring cycle before I can detect any reasonable changes in the mussels' growth patterns.
And then does your study of the relocation of mussels apply to the Grand River restoration?
I believe so. Stuff that we learned from this project, such as preferred habitat and water quality requirements for mussels, can be used to transfer it into the translocation sites for the Grand River to better improve the overall health and survivability of the translocated mussels from the Grand River.
Along the lines of the Grand River restoration, Matt, I have a question for you. What will the impact be on the restoration by the projected increase in rainfall and rainfall intensity and stream flow as the future?
Yeah, I might not be the best person on our team to answer that, but I can kind of take a shot and tell everybody just kind of where we've been in terms of the amount of time and kind of planning that's gone into how we're doing the hydraulic modeling and the review. That's been a very important topic of conversation with Eagle and with other staff members from different state and federal agencies in terms of making sure that whatever we do in the river does not impact, obviously, the ability to maintain the flood protection and allow those flows to go through. So in our modeling, we have been using very conservative numbers to try to predict some of those larger and more frequent events. It's difficult, obviously, not knowing exactly what you're going to do. But some of that modeling and the way that we've developed those modeling efforts does use some very conservative numbers to try to accommodate for some of that potential increases. We've been looking not only at just the impacts to the project to the 100-year storm, but also to some of the smaller and more frequent storms that we may see more frequently as a result of some of these increased flows and events.
Great.
Matt, I can add to that a little bit too. You know, just the in-stream channel work, but there's a lot of the river edge work that is being redone, you know, the traditional flood walls that are along the river, containing the river, being able to open that up and allow the river edge to use some of that floodplain that it has. You know, it's like you said, it's all in the models, and you have to make sure that we're not going to increase the flooding at all, but at least it gives the river a little bit more room to kind of breathe, and it's still usable space. But by moving that flood protection back, you're just kind of gaining a little bit of the natural river channel back.
Next question is for Beth. With the current state of the world, municipal resources are becoming severely tapped. Are there other resources out there that you know of or could share, specifically for municipalities or other nonprofits that do resiliency work?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing that, and it's pretty frightening what's happening across municipal budgets and across state budgets too, frankly. So I think that there are, you know, there's a whole body of funding that's obviously getting spun up from the federal government right now. There's significant efforts that need to be made to ensure that the investment in recovery dollars from COVID-19 are actually going to the efforts that are going to apply towards climate resilience too, and looking to future infrastructure and the kind of future of our built and social environment that we want to have. I encourage people to think about how you want to get involved in that. ASAP has a body of work that we're releasing today to make calls to insist that recovery dollars do go to climate resilience. There's a handful of funders in the philanthropic community that are supporting climate resilience. The Kresge Foundation does this, the Wege Foundation does this, the Herb Foundation does this, especially for water-related work. I mean, Herb is very water centered, where Kresge has a more adaptation resilience center that kind of goes out from there. Others in our, you know, community or this broad area, the Herb Foundation has a climate program, doesn't have a lot of domestic application, but depending on where you are, you can find funding. And then I think that there is, you know, there are some pathways for municipalities to be adopting new CRS standards when they look at their floodplain maps and looking at ways to be able to have have improved credit scoring by taking resilience actions. And so the short version is that times are going to be hard. As I have said to people, the good news is that times have always been hard for adaptation and resilience work, so it's not really new. It's kind of more tough times. But I also think that there's a real willingness right now for people to think about the future and to think about how we want to I don't really like the idea of restarting our economy. Kind of hurts my heart. I feel like there are a lot of people who are working really hard right now, and I don't like undermining the work that they're putting in and the time they're putting in. But as this crisis kind of passes over and through us, like, how do we want to look on the other side? And I think that there's a window of opportunity that is open right now for moving resilience activities forward, and we have to be really conscientious and intentional about taking it.
And Dan, kind of along the same lines, in your presentation, you had talked about neighborhood resiliency champions. So we're talking about resources for municipalities or business owners or residents. Who typically takes the lead on setting up these neighborhood resiliency champions, and do they collaborate with each other?
Well, and I'd say that's more of a generic term than a specific programmatic outcome. And I think the basic idea is, and this is something we learned working with a colleague who had investigated how businesses survived post Hurricane Katrina and subsequent hurricanes in New Orleans, Louisiana. And one of the things that they found was that in certain neighborhood pockets there were businesses that emerged and institutions that emerged as kind of your neighborhood leaders who had the understanding of how to access specific resource, what some of the threats people should be thinking about might be, and I think it's pretty easy to kind of conceptualize this and putting it in the context of the current environment, where we're living through a pretty good test case of what a major climate event could look like, or a climate crisis or catastrophe moving forward a generation, where like right now, you see within certain neighborhood business clusters or other aligned business affiliations. So, say the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, you have these one or two businesses who have an understanding of how banking and loans work, and are educating all the other businesses around how to access a PPP loan. And certain people have an understanding of how unemployment works, and can shepherd their colleagues through the various requirements to do that legally and equitably and justly. And I think those same concepts can be fairly easily applied to a sub-watershed concept, where you can identify these businesses in each community that have an understanding of what the best practices are, and have a good understanding of why you'd want to do these things, and enable them through these existing neighborhood of other affinity groups to provide that champion and leadership, and get all the people, get everyone moving along these paths towards greater resiliency.
Thanks. Lee, I've been getting a few questions from multiple communities that are asking how they can get involved in similar projects to the ones that you discussed in your presentation. So I don't know if maybe you could share some ideas on that, or maybe what sort of funding could be available to different communities, at least when talking about like assessing their tree canopy. I thought that your presentation was great, and I think that a lot of communities would like to have a canopy assessment like that.
Yeah, so first off, there are some free tools available that use the iTree models, which are the same models we applied for ecosystem benefit analyses. So you can go to itreetools.org, and one tool is called iTree Canopy, which does a very simple canopy assessment. It won't give you a map, but it will give you a percentage, and it will give you an estimate of ecosystem benefits for the trees in your community. There's also iTree Landscape, which is a little bit more complicated to use, but it does use remote sensing data to essentially create it's sort of a low resolution map of your community. But you can play around with different geographies and look at how you might prioritize tree planting in different census blocks in your community. So that's a neat tool as well. So those are free, anyone can use them. It takes, maybe a couple hours to get familiar with them and generate a, relatively reasonable report for your community. I'm happy to help people troubleshoot that. Our company is one of the co-developers of that, along with the software, along with the U.S. Forest Service. To do a full-scale tree canopy assessment of your community, where you get maps and customized analyses for your community, those are, for what they offer, relatively reasonably priced. But there are some different funding sources in the state to be aware of that can help fund that. One of those is the Michigan DNR Urban and Community Forestry Program. It does have a grant program every year where funding is available to promote urban forest management. And so there is a grant category for management planning up to $20,000 that can be accessed for most communities. And for a lot of communities, that would probably cover the cost of doing the assessment. Otherwise, if you're doing work that leads to on the ground direct impacts like our project did, there's funding sources like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, where maybe an initial assessment is helping you target how to do your work better, but then it's leading directly to doing something on the ground. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative requires on the ground impact, so you can't just do a planning activity. It has to be part of what then you're going to follow up and do. Those are the main ones I've seen happen. If people are curious about it, certainly they can reach out to me. They can play with iTree. They can. Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Forest Service funding is out right now, due June 28th, I believe. So now's the time to look at that. I would be looking for the Michigan Urban and Community Forestry grants near the end of July, early August.
Thanks.
Yeah, I might also add in the topic of resources too. If especially for visualization education, there are a lot of cool tools out there. Available through NOAA, the EPA, the Duke University Climate Clearinghouse, GLSA in Michigan, that are really intriguing to play around with. I use a screen grab that I take from our presentations a lot, where we take where you can take communities like Grand Rapids, plug it in against high and low emission scenarios, and see in 30 and 70 years what your community might resemble as far as moving down the map, or various emissions levels. So I think without too much difficulty, just Googling around a little bit, there are a lot of really cool resources out there to identify, especially from a visualization standpoint.
Thanks, Dan. The next question is for Sophia, and maybe Wendy, you want to chime in on this too. This question came specifically from a sub-watershed group, and they're wondering if you think that climate resilience and plans like the one that you presented on will become a regular feature in future watershed management plans across the state.
We're hoping so. I think up until this point, a lot of watershed management plans have definitely focused on non-point source pollution as kind of the prevailing threat against a watershed. And more we're seeing that we can't separate out these climate impacts from all the other things going on in a watershed, that your land use impacts how climate will impact your community and impacts what the climate in your community will be. That development in the community can't be separated from how climate is changing things. And so I think it will take a bit of time before it becomes kind of accepted, but I think at least bits and pieces are going to start coming in of variable precipitation, higher magnitude storms. All of that is kind of a necessary consideration because our infrastructure isn't holding and our current system isn't working.
Yeah, that's great. The only thing I would add is that, we've seen a lot of the grant applications that are out, and a lot of the requests for applications, they require some sort of climate discussion in your proposal. So, a lot of them are requiring us to look toward the future a little bit. So these are going to become really important, and I think it's going to become much more of a mainstream concept in a lot of the plans that we've been developing.
And it wasn't 90 days ago that the state announced that they were going to issue a fairly large grant RFP and fund a great deal of activity among watersheds to look at climate resiliency in general terms and in response to high water. That might not happen now, but I think when budgets return to normal, you can see you can likely expect some of those things to start to resources to come back.
And I just wanted to build on something that Wendy said, because I think that there's two things that you're likely to see. There's going to be more resilience plans, climate adaptation plans, and then there's going to be more integration of the climate adaptation and resilience principles across all planning. And some of that is going to end up being state driven, where state begins issuing requirements for how stormwater plans, hazard mitigation plans, et cetera, incorporate future climate information. That's happened in other states. Michigan has not taken the same step to actually require use of Atlas 14 or future looking data, but it is something that is likely to occur. And then where you see these principles being integrated, because just as Sophia said, we can't separate out the climate impacts from the other concerns of the watershed anymore. And so I think that there should come a point where we become sophisticated enough at doing this and conscious enough at doing climate work that it isn't necessarily having to be in a standalone plan, but it is really effectively integrated. One of the risks of integration before you're really ready to do it is that in a plan that has a lot of priorities, it then gets deprioritized. So one of the advantages of the resilience plan that stands on its own is that it has its own kind of pedestal to say, like, this is work that needs to be done. It can't just be put on the list of the other priorities. The flip side is that it's a plan and it stands on its own. So it can be hard to get to if it's not integrated. But I think that each community can kind of ask that question, are we ready for integration, or are we at the point that we need to have a piece of work that calls out this risk so that we understand it explicitly and then have it become integrated into our future work?
And Wendy and Sophia, is there a place where people could find this plan in the future?
In the future, yes. It's not quite done. We're still drafting it and getting input from our sub-watersheds and some of the other committees that we want to make sure we include recommendations and their voices in this plan as well. So once it's in a final draft, we'll send it out for lots of reviews, and then there'll be a rollout of it and helping sub-watersheds really actually apply the plan.
Awesome.
I don't know the timeline yet.
It will all be posted on the ELGRO website
Yes.
when it's ready. This next question is for Peter and Jillian, and I'm hoping that Matt and Josh with their work can chime in. Peter and Jillian, how do you see the water quality monitoring efforts fitting into the bigger picture of building resiliency? And then how do you hope that this data will be used long-term?
So we really hope that with our data that we collect, we'll get continuous data throughout, as well as periodic sampling. So we hope that overall it'll give us a really good idea about the quality of the river throughout. And doing so, we probably will do a water quality index at certain sites so we can kind of get a sense of, is it poor water quality, is it excellent, and everything in between. So we hope once we get that evaluation and we collect and get some good data this summer, hopefully with our plans being a little changed due to COVID, but we still hope with this that we'll be able to at least share the data with the public and have it available to the public, as well as policymakers if possible, and kind of just get an idea about what's happening. Yeah.
I decided that I think the role that we hope to play is to be a data provider so people can make good decisions about management and get this kind of bigger picture of the river that maybe any given watershed might not have the bigger picture, so they can see where they fit into that bigger picture in terms of water quality and how it's changing as you go from the headwaters to the mouth. So hopefully we'll be able to provide that kind of bigger picture view that people can place themselves in.
Yeah, Matt or Josh, do you guys have anything to add as far as we're talking about resiliency, but specifically for like river restoration and the monitoring that will happen eventually with that?
I was going to say that their project fascinates me because with the continuous data they collect, we can hopefully be able to map areas that have potential for supporting mussel beds, and mussels, like I talked about in my presentation, are vitally important to the ecosystem as they act as the liver for the river, taking in all the toxins and whatnot. And so this will hopefully be able to improve the water quality in areas by introducing mussels to places that can support mussels that currently do not have mussels.
And Kara, I would just maybe add, kind of similar to what Josh was saying, just, you know, as much as we've got a lot of really great experts working on the design and the, you know, trying to create this habitat, there's still a lot of unknowns in terms of, you know, what these types of restoration projects, how they really do affect that habitat and the water quality. So as much of that pre and kind of post data that we can get will help inform future river restoration projects in terms of how you really maximize that habitat and the creation of that new habitat and improving the water quality in the river.
Great. Just got another question in talking about agriculture, and it's specifically related to the survey questions that we asked all attendees as part of the registration process that we briefly covered in one of the introductory presentations for the forum. So this question says that agriculture was identified as an issue that people thought was a big issue in our watershed, but what do you recommend as strategies to engage farmers and producers to address non-point source pollution on working lands? And I guess this question is kind of open to anyone who wants to take a stab at it.
I guess, you know, we're, I think, working closely with our partners in all the conservation districts that are throughout the watershed, engaging in some of the organizations that gather those producers together. You know, that's really been our success so far, is working with NRCS and the conservation districts. You know, they're the people out on the land, working with the farmers, knowing the practices, knowing what they can do, and knowing what's available. You know, through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program grant that we have, you know, half is going to the river restoration and the other half is going to upstream watersheds. And it's really been critical to have those conservation districts be the ones out, you know, on the ground, meeting one-on-one with the producers, and just getting that relationship and getting that trust, knowing that, you know, they have funding available to help them, but not only that, just helping them plan and doing conservation plans to help them for the future. So, you know, it's really making sure that you're partnering with the people that can talk to the producers, as we've talked about before, just, you know, using their language and understanding their situations and the concerns that they have.
Yeah, I think that this work is another place where ensuring you have, as Wendy said, having the right message and meeting people where they are is really important. There's certainly a growing movement around soil health and soil conservation, and the connection that that can have to climate resilience and climate mitigation. The last Farm Bill had significantly more funding in it for cover cropping and for soil health, doing soil health studies, soil health pilots. And so I think that being literate in that language that opens doors to working with agricultural community is really important. And also being well equipped to know where those funding mechanisms exist through USDA, through the Farm Bill, and where you can help to get people who are on working lands the resources that they need to manage their lands in a way that's going to be feasible for them. There's pretty strong coalitions between like soil health from you know, crop producers to commodity croppers who are very interested and kind of concerned about the shifts that we could be seeing in agricultural production in the state, with more commodity crops moving into the state and what that means for specialty crops. So kind of looking at that position and how to be supportive of the industries that we really value, whether those are apples, cherries, grapes, and thinking about the way that they want to be tended to and protected. And then the dairy farmers have a really neat group of dairy farmers that are working on soil health and and protection, really led out of by some folks in Wisconsin that I'd be happy to make connections to if there was interest there.
Thanks. The next question I have is for Lee. And that question is, what is the role that you see urban forestry or community forestry efforts playing in the watershed resiliency plan? So is there anything that we need to focus on besides just getting trees in the ground?
Yeah. So I think what matters is not so much planting trees, but expanding canopy coverage, right? You know, we live in a state that wants to be forested, originally was forested. We cleared it for a variety of reasons. And those natural ecosystems are very good at doing what we want them to do when it comes to managing water. It just so happens that for a variety of reasons, those natural systems have been degraded. Most of those reasons are connected to us. So, you know, I think what matters more is how do we restore those natural ecosystems? And in our urban environments, one of the greatest tools we have at our disposal is just expanding the forested cover that exists. So certainly one answer is putting trees where they are, but perhaps a bigger answer is letting the trees that are already there grow. You know, I like, when I talk to a number of communities, I often say that even a modest canopy goal can often be achieved if you just stop cutting any down. Now that's not realistic for a variety of reasons, but I think it sets the point effectively is any strategy that concentrates solely on planting is bound to fail. You also have to think about how you're going to provide aging trees care, how are you going to give the trees room to grow, how are you going to ensure that people take them into account when they're rebuilding houses, how do you ensure that people just value them? And it's not just the trees, but it's also how do you add vertical diversity to that structure too? And you know, how do we have shrubs in there? How do we have the understory? How do we try to just bring nature back into our cities at the bottom line?
Thanks. And speaking of bringing nature back into our cities, Matt, the next question that I have is for you. Will the river be accessible while the upstream area is being constructed?
So that's a great question, one that we, and we're working closely with the city of Grand Rapids on as well. There's a number of considerations to kind of factor into that, and obviously the biggest one is just public safety risks. So our goal is to hopefully get the RCPP, the lower reach, constructed and get that open and available. Now we might have times during the construction where the river will have to be closed off again because of public safety, because of potentially higher flows. But we do hope to see that some of that lower reach could be utilized when the upstream Sea Lamprey Barrier project is being constructed. But that's something that we'll have to continue to evaluate, work closely with the city and various public safety agencies on to make sure that obviously it's a safe experience.
Thanks. My next question is for Dan, and I'm hoping maybe Beth, with your experience, that you could chime in on this also. But the question, Dan, is how do you overcome the obstacle of those who don't believe in climate change in businesses and institutions? I would imagine that this could affect some of your work. So how do you normalize it with those who might reject the idea of climate change?
Well, there's a certain element of self-selection in that if someone does not believe in climate change at all, we probably won't be talking to them in the first place because they're not going to pick up the phone. But I think I think when we do encounter that in a business and institutional setting, and I think probably more so in an institutional setting where you have people from different ideologies who have elected office and are engaged stakeholders. I think the largest part of it is just to find points of common ground and to look for ways to remove the specific pain points they have, because I think we find and social science tends to prove this out, that people aren't necessarily at the root of things. People aren't generally against the idea of the climate changing in the same way that there's people out there who believe the Earth is still flat. people tend to have the negative response to the things that come along with climate change. So government intervention, promotion of progressive policies, clean energy, so on and so forth. So in the context of this, where you're talking about climate resiliency, I think there's ways to have the conversation based on what their present needs are. So I think it's really easy right now to have a conversation about high water levels in conservative communities, because they have high water levels and they're flooded, and it's hard not to believe it when you walk on your front porch and fish. So I think more often than not, if we're going to have the conversation, the climate kind of helps us along with that, and we could and if they are predisposed to not believe in it, they're going to ultimately defer to what their eyes are telling them. And even if they have some skepticism of the science in a very general way, they can see something's going on, and they can recognize that they have a responsibility, and they're being compelled to address it, because otherwise it's going to impact their self-interest.
Yeah, I would just back up with what Dan said. You know, people have a pretty clear sense that things are changing around them. How they want to come to terms with that is a different question. The approach of helping people, recognizing expertise, recognizing experience, identifying thresholds. You know, so we talk about threshold analysis quite a lot when we talk about the application of climate data in an effective way. What's the threshold that matters to you? What's the temperature at which you can no longer send your employees outside to do work in the outdoors during a heat event? What's the temperature threshold where your concrete buckles? Like, what's the temperature threshold that matters, and how are we going to be encountering it more often? Is your system able to withstand it? If somebody starts a conversation with me that I don't believe in climate change, so what are you going to do about it? Like, it's a pretty quick conversation for me, because I don't have a lot to do with that. That's unfortunate for them. It's deeply unfortunate for all of us. But I think finding like what matters to people, finding their expertise, where you want to have a will, where you have a will to work and they have a will to work, finding the data that helps them get their work done is important. But you know, there's a lot of anti-science out there right now. And luckily I am not in a position where I have to try to correct for that. I'm in a position where I'm supporting the people who are actively trying to do adaptation and resilience work. So I have the honor and the joy to really support people who are kind of putting it out there. And more often, those are the ones having the conversation than I am.
And Beth, I appreciated that in your presentation, you talked about the importance of both individual actions and transformative change. So this question is kind of for everyone. I'm wondering how you balance those approaches in your work, your individual actions, and then approaching transformative change. And do you spend more time on one approach, and why? So if anybody wants to take a stab at that one.
Like a really dorky way of answering this is like, there's a lot about metrics and evaluation in this question. Like, what do you want? What is could be your theory of change? At ASAP, it's our chain of impact. What are you trying to achieve? And then what are the steps that you're taking, and how are you measuring their success? Because it's often in those little steps that you're going to get to transformational change, but it's really important that you have the vision set out of what you're going for. And I think in my talk, I talked about how glad I am that our organization adopted a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion statement last month, which said that going forward, ASAP talks about climate change and it talks about justice, and we do those things in tandem with each other. And so now it's for us to build out the metrics by which we can say that we're successfully addressing climate change and justice. And so the day-to-day work can feel really small, but it's having really laid a pathway for you to see what the path is for transformational change, even through those day-to-day activities.
I think to build on that a bit, I think the metric sheet that Beth is talking about is something hopefully we're going to provide and provide that data that can be used by others to really gauge the health of the river and the vitality of the river in different reaches, and maybe in response to different management plans that are being applied and resiliency plans or whatever the plans we're talking about. I think hopefully we'll be able to give that kind of information when we're done.
Beth also talked in her presentation about the power of incremental change to get us towards transformational change. And that's the perspective we've taken a lot in writing the resilience plan, is that we're not asking the sub-watersheds to identify the most audacious goal and to do that first, but instead to identify things that they can actually accomplish within the sub-watersheds to kind of get this on the table and get this going. And once there is a system in place and once there is community interest and capacity, then that can scale up towards transformational change. But at the moment with the resilience plan, we're far more focused on getting people to do something than on getting them to do the biggest, most audacious plan they can implement.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. And I just want to know from each of you, what is one action that attendees to the forum could take right now, today, in order to address resiliency in their community? I know Sophia in her presentation gave many examples of practices that watershed residents could use, but I want to hear from each of you what you think that one action that attendees could take today is. So maybe Sophia, if you want to start, give us one of those examples.
Sure. I think kind of two perspectives. I think the education side is really important. So there's still plenty of people in our watershed who don't really know what watershed they live in, either, you know, large scale or what sub-watershed. So I would say most attendees here probably know what sub-watershed they're in. If you don't, go figure that out today. And then help someone else figure that out sometime in the near future, and just kind of getting people thinking along those lines. And then also just green infrastructure at home, whether that's planting a garden, having a rain barrel, figuring out what that looks like and helping that become normal in your community.
Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing is just building on, you know, finding out what watershed you're in. Look to see if there's a group that's already involved in doing things. You know, join that group, see what you can do. Do the, you know, just to connect with people that, you know, you have a connection with because of that waterway, because of that sub-watershed. So, yeah, that's just kind of a first step.
Lee, what do you think?
I'm going to piggyback off Sophia here and say that, you know, a lot of my work has been at the intersection of people and nature, and how do you particularly harness nature in order to do things for people. And so one of the best things is just wander around your backyard, and what little space of pavement can you chip out and put in a native garden? Or better yet, is there a spot where you have a lot of sun and could use a tree? And if you're feeling, you know, particularly motivated, and you live in a village or a city in Michigan, it's likely a Tree City USA community, which means it likely has a tree board or some authority responsible for management of trees. Try attending a meeting.
Awesome. Peter or Jillian, you guys have anything to add?
I would just say, you know the data that's available for your watershed and what it says, and what people who have studied the watershed know about it. And if there are things that you would like to know, contact folks like us and say, hey, can you study this for us? Can you help us collect data? Because we would love to have, you know, folks make requests and say, hey, we'd like to know about this element or this chemical. Can you help us out?
And building off that too, like just what Lee said, just like keep connected to nature, keep it local. Try to see what you can do within your own community and within your own backyard to just keep that connection with nature.
The first, like I want to say, I think incremental change gets a bad rap. Like incremental change isn't bad. Those add up. But looking at the list of attendees who are on the call today, and kind of if I was going to give a call to action for them to do one thing, take the link to the Elgrove Spring Forum virtual presentation, put it in an email, say, hey, I participated in this today. We should be thinking about climate resilience adaptation, and just send it to 5 people. And if you're part of a municipality, ideally send it to your colleagues and your board.
I love that, Dan. Josh or Matt, you guys have anything to add?
I was going to say humans have like an innate attachment to wildlife and nature. Learning what cool species are in your watershed is a good first step into conserving your watershed, and as well as those species that are within it.
Yeah, I was going to kind of echo what Sophia said, but also I think what Josh just touched on is really important and just goes back to that education. I mean, Wendy and I and others are fortunate to go out and speak to a lot of people about the river and the species that are in it. And it's amazing how many people don't realize, you know, that the water from their driveway runs into the storm drain that runs into the river. So I think that education component is huge. And then when you get people to learn about that and learn about all the cool and unique things that we have in our watershed, they're more likely to get into that conservation mode and believe in some of these projects and why we have to do them.
That's great. Beth, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I have a couple, I'd kind of build on what Dan said, and I would encourage you to make those phone calls to your representatives. There's a time right now to be thinking about climate resilience, and it can be hard, and I'd be happy to share the language that we have, the talking points that we have at ASAP about how to do this and how to build that message. And then the second thing I would add is that it's really important to find the joy in this work. It can feel often like maybe this work should have been done sooner, or there's a lot of work left to do. But I really try to find the joy in what we do day to day. And it's celebrating the incremental and keeping an eye towards what's coming. And so being here and being part of the conversation is one of those joys, and it has been for me. So I just wanted to say thank you also.
Yeah, it looks like we're just up to our time limit, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but we sincerely appreciate all of you for attending this afternoon. Remember that this webinar was recorded and will be available with all other forum presentations through Algro's website and our YouTube channel. And I would really like to give a special thank you to the speakers of this year's forum. You all brought your amazing expertise and helped us to continue to bring awareness to this topic of resiliency in the watershed. And then I'd also like to thank the many sponsors of this year's forum. Your continued support is the reason that Algro can do so many amazing things. And finally, thank you to everyone who attended for being invested in the health and resiliency of the Lower Grand River watershed. Please stay safe and stay healthy. And we're looking forward to a time when we can meet all of you in person. But until then, please continue to keep your lakes great and your river grand. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.